Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Snare Drum Virtuoso podcast. My name is Jonathan Curtis and today we're going to be discussing the repertoire. This is something I've talked about a lot in the previous 2 episodes. I make lots of reference to engaging with the repertoire and practicing the repertoire and the history of the repertoire and all these things. And it occurred to me that it may not be completely clear about what I'm talking about. We all know the repertoire to broadly be a body of work, a body of pieces and things like that, but I thought I would take this opportunity to expand on that a little bit and describe not only what the repertoire is, but some of the important and key pieces from within that repertoire. Now, in the introduction there, we were listening to a passage from one of my own pieces entitled Ishvara, which was one of the first compositions I wrote and published in a collection called Snare Drum Compositions Volume 1. And it's a really interesting piece. It's got lots of very dense, small figures, and one that I had a lot of fun composing. Now, as always, before we begin, if you enjoy what you hear in these podcasts, you are very welcome to visit me at my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk. I have a wealth of information across all of my publications, various essays and research papers, interviews, information about my private lessons, including online lessons for international students, or it would be great for you to just get in touch and say hello. I'm always happy to discuss these things. I also have a wealth of more focused educational videos on my YouTube channel /JCurtisDrums. So you are welcome to visit there as well if you would like to learn more about any particular topic. Now, before we begin, I'm going to play a piece by the late, great Michael Skinner. Michael was a stalwart of the British snare drumming community and over the decades has produced many, many pieces. I don't want to put a number on it. I have no idea how many he's produced in total, but I do know that he was single-handedly responsible for producing the entirety of the Trinity snare drumming syllabus, which I had the pleasure of performing with recently. And I'm going to show one of his pieces here. I think it would be a nice little tribute for Michael Skinner, who sadly passed away at the end of 2023. This is a piece from the Grade 8 repertoire list. This is called Kaiser March. So in dedication to Michael Skinner, let's enjoy Kaiser March. Now, in hearing those 2 pieces, the selection from Ishvara at the beginning and Kaiser March just a moment ago, we already hear contrast, we hear differences between these pieces. And of course, the repertoire available to the snare drum is vast, varied, and multifaceted. It would be a boring instrument indeed if all of the repertoire sounded the same. So the repertoire, as I discuss it, refers to essentially 2 things that kind of work in parallel together. One of those is a general reference to something that is written for the purposes of performance. Now, this may include educational aspects like etudes and things like this, but generally speaking, by repertoire, I'm referring to things that are pieces of music that are to be learned and performed, rather than, say, an exercise. Secondly, I often make reference to specific elements within the repertoire that are perhaps seminal, renowned, famous, or historically significant. So there's kind of this double-pronged approach here. There's the body of work generally for the snare drum, and then there are the particular elements within that, the repertoire, that are sort of standard or expected, or at least well worth anybody's time. Now, I want to begin with the first of these two ideas, the general repertoire that refers to the whole collected body of works for the snare drum. Now, of course, this is, as I said, vast, multifaceted, varied, and far too big for me to try to cover in its totality in a single episode, or even, who knows, a single series. There's just so much of it. Now, the one thing to understand, first of all, as I said last time on the episode to do with the rudiments, is that the snare drum is very, very old. Hundreds and hundreds of years of history. So the repertoire list stretches back a long way. We have as early as the 15 and 1600s named pieces or manuals and books that start to standardize some of the famous pieces. Or even before that, there were traditional and folk and marching pieces that would have been known and memorized even before things were being written down. So the collection is vast and varied and indeed ancient in many respects. Now, to fully understand the breadth of the repertoire available to us as performers and practitioners, we need to understand a little bit about the different snare drumming traditions. Now, by tradition here, I am referring to a general location, a country or a culture or a particular region that has had specific contributions and made specific developments to the snare drum. Now, in many respects, many different countries have their own snare drumming traditions, but there are certainly some that have had a far more profound effect and have taken it more deeply. We might think of something in the same way as being a football country. There is a reason that the same countries end up in the quarterfinals and the semi-finals and the finals of the World Cup in football, because they are football countries. Their tradition of football is stronger. Maybe they put more focus in it. It's more popular. It's more funded. Who knows? But we can kind of broadly understand it in the same way. So the really important ones that I'm going to talk about today are the Swiss, the French, the British, and the American. These four traditions generally dominate modern drumming. Now, that doesn't mean they are inherently superior to the contributions from any other countries, certainly not. But they are the ones that are perhaps the oldest, the most well-developed, and the most studied. Now, of the four of these, the Swiss is the eldest. The Swiss mercenaries in the 1380s, potentially as far back as the 1310s, were known to carry snare drums or something approaching snare drums into battle. So we have hundreds of years of drumming development, and much of that stems from the Swiss. Who knows why? I can't answer that today. I don't know why. But the Swiss drumming tradition spread throughout Europe, most notably to France, the UK, Scotland, and finally, latterly, across the Atlantic to America. Now, it is very difficult from an historical perspective to trace those roots. This was undocumented for a long time. We can focus on the vocabulary, we can look at some of the repertoire itself, but to actually follow in any great detail the transmission of Swiss drumming to when it became a distinctly French thing and to when it became a distinctly Scottish thing is almost impossible. Very, very difficult to do. But there are certainly traits that are shared across all of these. We find similar rudiments, we find similar techniques, and we even find similarities in some of the repertoire as well. There is especially great similarity between some of the Swiss vocabulary and the Scottish vocabulary, which is very, very interesting. I would certainly say, despite the Swiss roots of the French tradition, these days Swiss drumming probably shares more in common with the Scottish than it does anything else. But that's maybe just my own interpretation of the material. Nevertheless, we find in the Swiss tradition some very interesting rhythmic devices, some things that would be unrecognizable in terms of notation to an Anglophonic drummer, but things that would nevertheless sound somewhat rudimental to our ears. And this is really the main thing that dominates the early repertoire from all four of these traditions. And it is the fact that the repertoire is functional. All of these traditions developed as military functions. So, as I've already said, the Swiss mercenaries were, of course, using snare drums in battle. This was the case for the French. From as early as the 16 and the 1700s, we have Philidor composing marches for the French kings. In the 1850s, we have very famous the Marche par Frise of the French Grenadier Guards, who were apparently renowned for their ability to perform the frise. We have Scots duty from the 1800s in the British Army, which were the body of fifes and drums, the Scottish bands that were used on parade and on the march and on the battlefield, perhaps. So all of this tradition, and of course, notwithstanding the American Civil War, the American marching tradition, the military tradition, that combined many of the aforementioned traditions. So, as I say, we find this common thread of military function across all of the early repertoire. So certainly anything up to the turn of the century, the early 1900s, and even beyond that through the First and Second World Wars, virtually all of the repertoire that comprised a snare drum, especially as a solo instrument, is militaristic in nature, strong in pulse, strong in rhythm, strong in cadence, because it needed to be. It needed to be recognizable. It needed to be functional. It needed to keep soldiers in time. It needed to convey orders urgently that would be loud and strong, and as I say, recognizable. So when we look at virtually all snare drum music, especially before 1900, but even since then, but all of what we would consider today as rudimental music, we find almost exclusively military marches, parade marches, orders, things like camp duty. In the American tradition, camp duty used to call soldiers to camp or to wake them in the morning or to call them for supper. They are functional. They are order transmitting. And it is only really after the turn of the century, and as I've suggested, after the Second World War, really, that the snare drum started to be explored in any serious manner as a musical instrument rather than solely a functional instrument. And this is really where my own interests lie, and certainly the focus of this episode today. Now, I did say before the turn of the century, very little music on the snare drum was not militaristic. Now, that's not entirely true. There were classical composers who utilized the snare drum in their orchestral works, but that placed the snare drum very much in an auxiliary position. And it's really the more contemporary repertoire, the modern repertoire, the body of pieces we have today, especially in a solo context, that I really want to focus on today, because they're the pieces and they're the bodies of work that are really of value to us. So, in terms of these early traditions, these are the first places we can look for the seminal collections. And it is these seminal collections that I want to talk about now. I want to work my way through the traditions and provide a brief overview of the main bodies of repertoire before we advance into the modern era. Now, beginning with the Swiss, we generally want to be looking at the works of Fritz Berger. He was a Swiss drum teacher and method book author and was generally called the Drummel-Doktor, the drumming doctor. You're going to have to excuse my German here. Now, Fritz Berger was born in 1895 and he lived to the age of 68, dying in 1963. And he is generally considered to be the father of modern Swiss drumming. He developed his own notational system to help the spread of Swiss drumming in other countries. He worked closely with drummers from North America and Scotland, promoting the basal rudimental system. He produced his own method books. He produced his own pieces. So in terms of the publications, there are 5 main works that he produced that contain much of his repertoire. There are three volumes of one collection called Das Basler Trommeln, 3 volumes between 1928 and 1956. In 1964, there's the Instructor for Basel Drumming, and then there's Trommelmarschen volumes 1 to 3 between 1959 and 1965. So these are the main publications from Berger that comprise much of the modern Swiss tradition. Obviously, there are other Swiss composers, there are many other publications and collections, but in terms of a brief overview, it's Berger's work in the basal style that kind of defines the modern tradition, and much of his work is prominent in modern bands like Top Secret, one of the very famous drum corps that marches at the Edinburgh Tattoo and tours around the world. Now, I think the reason Berger is so prominent in the tradition is due to his international relations. As I said, he worked with drummers from North America and Scotland. He performed at the Royal Albert Hall through the BBC in 1961. He published material that was specifically for an international audience. Generally speaking, his collections of Das Basler Trommeln were for a Swiss audience. Yet his Instructor for Basal Drumming from 1964 is intended for an American audience. This was the very reason behind developing his new notational system, to allow international students to perform the Swiss repertoire. So in terms of an access point, an entry point into the Swiss tradition, Berger's work is certainly a great starting point. In fact, his contribution to modern drumming today can't be overstated. He is recognized in the North American tradition through the Percussive Arts Society. The Berger Lesson 25 is a hybrid rudiment, obviously named after him. This is generally thought to be due to his influence towards the founding of the Percussive Arts Society. And today, the international rudiments, the 40 rudiments, include the single flammed mill and the Swiss Army triplet, which are Swiss rudiments. They appear to be a point of contention through John Pratt, which is interesting. John Pratt, in his own International Association of Traditional Drummers, was very much keen to promote countries holding on to their own traditional vocabularies, whereas the Percussive Arts Society and Berger were keen to exchange ideas. So there was a point of contention there. But regardless, as I say, exploring the work of Berger is really the key to beginning to understand the broader Swiss repertoire. And as I say, the work of Berger in terms of his contributions and his rudimental legacy are kind of the starting point to understand the rudimental traditions as they exist today. Now, moving on to the French tradition, we need to begin with a character called Robert Gut. Born in 1919 and sadly passing away in 2014, Robert Gut was a member of the French Air Force and latterly a drum major in the Air de Paris, an art gallery tasked with preserving significant pieces of French art and culture. Now, this is really significant for us here because thanks to the efforts of Robert Gut and others, we have volumes entitled Tambour d'Ordonnance, 4 volumes that comprise collections of historical French snare drumming repertoire. So as I record this, I'm holding in my hands here in front of me volume 3 of this collection, volume 3 of Tambour d'Ordonnance, which is one of Robert Gut's collections here. And as I flick through the first few pages, I'm looking at pieces here from the 1700s. Batterie de l'Armée Française, Regne de Louis XIV. So drumming pieces for the French army during the reign of Louis XIV. You're going to have to excuse my pronunciation. Extracts from Philidor, 1705. Marches, L'Assemblée, Le Retrait, which I guess is the retreat. As we turn the page here, more from Philidor, La Descente des Armes, La Descente des Armes, 1674. Batterie de Tambour from 1670. So we have preserved reference, direct records of historical pieces of the French tradition from the 1670s. And this gives us great insight into the vocabulary they were using, the structure of the pieces. Dragons du Roi, 1705. Marche des Grenadiers et Cheval, again from Philidor. La Marche, La Charge, La Retraite, from the reign of Louis XVI. It's fascinating looking through it, and I appreciate you can't see it here. But as I'm looking at these pieces, I'm seeing rolls, I'm seeing double strokes, I'm seeing flams, I'm seeing drags, and I'm seeing a system of notation that was at some point helped pioneer by Fritz Berger, who I've already mentioned, with the notes on the right hand below the line and on the left hand above the line. We have imperial vocabulary. So the sorts of rudiments that these military drummers were using, le coup de charge, the coup, le roulement, the roue de 5, the roue de 5, so the 5 roll, the double flam, the simple tap, the reverse flam. These are typically French rudiments that we see as far back as the 1670s. It's absolutely fascinating. And this gives us access to the historical repertoire, right? This gives us access to the equivalent of things like the Connecticut halftime and 3 camps in the American tradition. This gives us access to hundreds of years of French vocabulary. Now, as we progress through the book and we come forward in time, we see collections by Alexandre Reynaud, who was a contemporary of Robert Gut and much admired by him, who is himself responsible for producing many pieces of original repertoire in the French style. So between Reynaud and Gut and others, Quinchon, in this collection, we find the main body of the traditional French repertoire. So as a beginning point, the collections of tambour d'ordonnance from Robert Goutte provide a perfect entry point into the French tradition, not only because we find dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of pieces of the historical tradition, but we find collections in the contemporary tradition written in that style. So we have pieces by Vignon, we have international contributions, representations from Greece, Iran, Japan, Luxembourg, the UK, Pakistan, and America, people that have contributed styles, contributed pieces in the French style, which is absolutely fascinating. Now, before we move on from the French tradition, because Goutte and his collection of ordnance and tambour is such a good starting point, but we can't leave the French tradition without a quick word about Guy Lefebvre. Guy Lefebvre was a student of Robert Goutte and much admired by him again. Robert Goutte wrote the foreword in Lefebvre's own book called Superior Technique. And Superior Technique was the first publication, certainly the first published in English, that attempted to codify the main techniques of the French tradition. And it presents rundowns of the use of frisé, it presents the use of rolls, subdivisions, tuplets, and the coup de charge, the typically French reverse flamme. So alongside the work of Goutte and Reynaud and all of those that are covered in the Ordonnance, it is well worth looking at Guy Lefebvre as well, because aside from his method books, the most famous of which being Le Technique Supérieure, Superior Technique, he did contribute his own repertoire as well. Now, as we turn to the British tradition, in which I am linking together the English and the Scottish, despite their differences, they are sort of culturally and historically bound together. Scots duty in the British Army occurred sometime in the 1800s, for example. But nevertheless, we find a shift in paradigm. And the main shift here is a much greater focus on the traditional collective repertoire of marching music. So far I've talked about key figures. I've talked about Fritz Berger and I've talked about Reynaud and Goutte. And these figures do to some degree exist in the British tradition. But when you are watching or performing in the British tradition, you are almost certainly going to be performing folk marches or famous marches that you would be expected to know if you operated in that world. And this comes from the military traditions of marching bands. So in the UK Armed Services, the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, they all have cadet branches. So there are the Air Cadets, there are the Naval Cadets, the Sea Cadets, there are the Army Cadets themselves. They all have marching bands, as do the emergency services. So there are police marching bands. There are lots of traditions based on marching. And of course, all of these marching bands have snare drum parts and they have collections of repertoire. So I happen to have in front of me a collection of pieces in the British marching tradition, and half of them don't have composers. There's no composers' names on these. Now, if they do have composers, I must apologise. I don't have access to that. But for example, one of the most famous ones is Portsmouth number ones, Pompey, as it's called. This is just a very famous marching piece. Conan Bridge, McAlpine. Now, it's only on some of these, McAlpine by Piner Senior, that a composer is even listed. And this is because of the nature of British marching, as I've said, is bound up in this marching tradition of traditional repertoire. Now, one of the key figures in the Scottish tradition is a chap called Jim Kilpatrick, who is an MBE and very well known and renowned for Scottish pipe drumming. And one of the reasons he's so famous, aside from his skill and ability as a Scottish pipe drummer, is to do with one of the uniquely pipe drum related activities, which is competition. Now, competition exists in all drumming. There are competitions in American rudimental drumming and drumline and things like this, but there are world championships in Scottish pipe drumming that have different classes, massed pipes and drums, and solo playing as well. And you might have duets with a single drummer and a bagpiper, for example. And Jim Kilpatrick has won many of these. He began competing at the age of 15, joining the Shotts and Dykehard Caledonia Pipe Band, and has gone on to win many titles and teach and perform all around the world. And this, again, shows a difference in paradigm because as far as I know, as far as I've been able to find, Jim Kilpatrick is not a prolific composer. He is a prolific performer. Now, that doesn't mean he's never composed anything. I'm sure over the years he has. But unlike perhaps Gut or Reynaud or Lefebvre or Berger, who produced massive bodies of original work in a style, Kilpatrick is somebody that is more famous for his performance of traditional pieces as opposed to producing his own works. So while it is very difficult to point to individual sources, those looking to expand their knowledge of the repertoire of the British traditions need to look at the traditional collections. And that is often found through the bands themselves. There's a strong community of marching bands who are in competition or performing at events and things like that, who have access to these collections, traditional collections. Honestly, I've struggled in researching for this episode, I've struggled to find published collections of any uniquely British repertoire. They are online, they are available online. And you can find sheet music, but it is very difficult to find published collections of these pieces because they are public domain. They are in the traditional sort of collections of the traditional consciousness of the people that have grown up in these marching bands. I happen to teach a girl, I think she's 15, and she's in various cadets and marching bands, and she just knows these pieces by heart. She can't tell me who wrote them. She can't tell me where she learnt them, but she just knows them because she was brought up in this marching tradition. Now, there are lots of things we can say about the vocabulary and the musical conventions of the Scottish tradition, but I want to leave that to another episode where I can dedicate more focus to that. But from the repertoire perspective, as I say, we need to be looking at the traditional marching collections, of which there are many, and they are varied, but they are also strangely difficult to find. Now, finally, we come to perhaps the dominant tradition in modern drumming, especially in the English-speaking world, which is the North American tradition. Now, the North American tradition did generally develop later than the others, although there are some early instances of publications and exchanges between Britain and America during the formation of the United States, during the Revolutionary Wars and the Wars of Independence, and even the Civil War, when standardization was occurring and early repertoire was appearing. But nevertheless, we find in the North American tradition a very strong lineage of teachers, composers, and performers that leave a vast body of work with, unlike the British tradition, very readily available published collections, which makes it very easy to explore and to research and, of course, to play and perform as well. So, without going too far into the history of it, we find through the development of the American Army, especially post-Civil War, we find collections of drum instruction, which start to standardize the rudiments. We find the publication and the appearance of famous pieces like the Connecticut Halftime or the Downfall of Paris or Hell on the Wabash that were well-known pieces from the Civil War or just after. And then something really important happens in the early 1900s. We find the formation of the National Association of Rudimental Drummers, NARD. And this brings with it something very similar to what occurred in France through Robert Gut and the Air de Paris. We find a concerted effort by a community of drummers seeking to preserve the historical tradition, the historical repertoire. These drummers, people like J. Burns Moore and William Ludwig and George Lawrence Stone, all got together to try to preserve the things they had learned and been shown, the pieces they knew, to publish them, which is one of the really important points, and then to contribute further in that style. So similarly to what we see in Gut's Ordonnance de Tambour, we have a collection of traditional repertoire, and then we have external contributions and modern contributions written in that style. And this is precisely what we see from Nard. So one of the fundamental publications here is simply called the Nard Book, America's Drum Solos. And it features a collection of 150 original compositions, including a few historic and traditional pieces, in the American style, in the American tradition. And these generally date somewhere between the 1920s and the 1940s, perhaps not quite as late as that. They're essentially, I believe, prior to Wilcoxon's time in the 1940s. And we find this massive collection of 150 solos in written form, in notation that we would immediately understand today, that not only preserve traditional pieces, but expand upon them in the traditional style. So this is a great entry point to the American repertoire, America's Drum Solos, the Nard book. And from here, we find almost a dedicated tribute to this from the aforementioned Charlie Wilcoxon, who came a little later, who produced his own book of 150 rudimental drum solos, the Wilcoxon book of 150 drum solos. And again, this is a massive collection of original pieces composed within the American tradition. So both of these books provide amazing insight and access to core rudimental pieces of the North American tradition. There is also, I mentioned William Ludwig, one of the founding members of Nard. There is also the Ludwig book which does something similar, but with a more balanced collection of both original pieces by Ludwig and a collection of traditional pieces as well. So, for example, in the Ludwig book, you find some of his own compositions, but you also find a version of the Connecticut Halftime. You find a version of Downfall of Paris. Or I think there's a version of Hell on the Wabash in there as well, which give you great, as I say, great insight into some of the traditional pieces of repertoire as well. And as you follow this forward, as we come forward through time, we start to see how these early pieces, and indeed we have access that allows us to see how these early pieces, the early vocabulary, the early structure, the early rudimental ideas, go on to directly inform more recent composers. So, of course, after Wilcoxon, we have John Pratt, one of the seminal composers of the 20th century, who is responsible for much of the modern repertoire in the American tradition, mostly through two books. John Pratt produced, I think, 4 or 5 books in his lifetime, possibly 1 or 2 more less well-known ones. But by far his most famous are 14 modern contest solos, and a latter piece, a latter collection, simply rudimental solos for accomplished drummers, or simply the Black Book because of its colour. Now, across, what have we got here? 3, 6, I think 7. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 publications listed under John Pratt. Some of them are less well known, as I suggested, but 14 modern contest solos and rudimental solos for accomplished drummers are generally his most famous. And they include collections of original pieces that essentially cemented his place as one of the great American composers and contributed greatly to the body of North American repertoire. So at least in terms of the historic rudimental tradition, the North American tradition is very well served by its publications. And we find lots of offshoots from this. There is a great selection of rudimental collections that are based on and drawn from the Nard collection, for example. So as I say, drummers looking to explore the American tradition are going to find this very, very easy indeed. I would suggest perhaps starting with the Nard book, then exploring Wilcoxon, and then Pratt. These are great entry points into the American tradition. Now, having encountered and having explored the main historical traditions, we finally arrive at the present day and the repertoire as it exists today. Now, the reason I wanted to cover the 4 traditions first is to kind of set the stage, because as we explore the repertoire as it exists today, we generally find one of 2 approaches. We find what we might consider the contemporary rudimental tradition, and then we find something brand new, which I've only very briefly touched on so far, and this is the orchestral tradition. So I will begin with the former, the modern rudimental tradition. Now, this is not unique to America, although I think it is probably dominant in America. We find these composers that write in a rudimental style, or at least influenced by the rudimental style, but without the military context. So we find composers like Bob Becker, we find composers like Joe Tompkins, who I've talked about before, and we find people who are generally considered rudimental composers, but not military drummers. They are not based in the marching traditions of the past. And this elevates rudimental drumming to a dedicated style of music, which I've talked about before. Now, the interesting thing here is that this has itself produced a vast body of work in a style, but in a contemporary manner as well. So I mentioned Bob Becker. Bob Becker is one of the great American composers, a founding member of the percussion group Nexus, and he's a pedagogue as well. So he works a lot in education and has produced a fantastic book called Rudimental Arithmetic. And he has produced some very famous pieces, Lahara and Mudra, for example. Now, the idea of being a rudimental composer but without the military tradition is a very modern idea. I think prior to the development of this style, that would have been a very strange thing for the founders of Nard, because drumming was tied up in the function of military. Whereas with people like Becker, we find an exploration of concept. We find an exploration of musical idea that is drawn from these historical traditions without being necessarily linked to them. So this is where we find in Becker, for example, the idea of a 5-stroke roll or measured rolls in general becoming a compositional tool rather than a function within part of a march. It's where we find the idea of paradiddles as a sticking concept being espoused, as opposed to just a piece of vocabulary that is used in a functional manner, as again I have discussed elsewhere. Likewise, in Tompkins, I've talked about Tompkins' work before on this podcast. In Tompkins, we find a collection of works dedicated to combining the French and the American traditions. Tompkins has 3 or 4, I know of at least 3, there are potentially 4 or more, collections of works called French-American rudimental solos. And when I've talked to him about this before, he talks about using the vocabulary and using the ideas in contrasting ways within the same pieces of music. So we find the development of international, contemporary, and conceptual repertoire that is born from the traditional repertoire without, as I say, being linked to it. So, for my money, I think some of the most interesting material in the contemporary rudimental tradition comes from Bob Becker. He has a collection of rudimental solos. He has a collection of ensemble pieces. It comes from Joe Tompkins, who has actually quite a large collection. He has 8 rudimental solos for snare drum. He has 3 or 4 collections of French-American rudimental solos. These are composers that have really explored the musical aspect. Of course, we have the more modern John Pratt collections, who was himself something of a contemporary development from the tradition, maybe bridging that gap. His pieces are certainly more traditional than Becker's and Tompkins, but nevertheless, it gives us this kind of stepping stone between the historical and the contemporary. And we also have the American tradition of drumline, which is again similar to the Scottish pipe band. It's a massed band form with its focus being on marching. It's the sort of thing you find at the Super Bowl halftime show, where hundreds of musicians are not only playing, but they are choreographing themselves and performing these incredible maneuvers that make a visual spectacle as well. And drumline has its own collection of pieces. It's from Drum Corps International, which are again based around marching, and we find collections from people like Scott Johnson or Casey Brohard or Bill Bachman, these people that have composed specifically for drumline, who have produced material for marching. And there are too many to name because this is a national phenomenon in North America. Each university and college has its own drumline, and there are the associated composers with them. So there is an entire body of work and repertoire dedicated to marching, drumline, and DCI. Now, finally, we come to the most different, I think, of all the traditions, and this is the modern orchestral tradition. Now, the reason this is so different is because it takes a completely different approach to not only the way pieces are composed, but the way in which they are performed. So the idea behind the orchestral tradition is to develop the snare drum as it is used in an orchestra, as the name suggests. Now, functionally, this is very, very different to the rudimental tradition. We don't find marches unless it is a classical orchestral march. We don't find military function. We find musical function. So as I say, in the early classical composers in which snare drum occurs, it's an auxiliary position that emphasizes certain accents, it emphasizes certain rhythmic lines, but it fulfills a very subsidiary role. Now, as time has gone by, various composers have started to explore the musical nature of the snare drum in this context. Perhaps the most famous of these in the modern tradition is Jacques Delacluse, a French composer who is not necessarily known for being a snare drummer necessarily, but a percussionist and a composer in his own right. And he has a very famous collection of orchestral repertoire called 12 Etudes, the 12 studies, which are sort of seminal within the orchestral tradition now, and they are 12 pieces for solo snare drum, but written in the orchestral tradition. Now, there are some very unique features to Delacluse's orchestral works that you don't find in the rudimental traditions of any country. It's very different to the Swiss, it's very different to the French rudimental tradition. The first thing is that the entire collection of Delacluse's pieces is almost completely absent of any form of sticking. So when you are faced with a drum solo, a snare drum solo, you would normally expect to find the sticking underneath, telling you which notes, which hands to play with for which notes. You would find an R or an L or something similar, whereas Delacluse's work is completely lacking this. You also find a much greater emphasis on musical phrase, motivic development, and away from the rudimental building blocks that are common in the rudimental styles. Now, when you explore Delacluse's work, for example, as somebody eminent in the orchestral field, these things can be a little disconcerting if you've not got a background in the orchestral context. And there's two reasons for this. The first, as I say, is that he lacks the sticking, which I'll come on to in a moment. But maybe the biggest difference is that the motifs and phrases used in Delacluse's work directly reference famous orchestral pieces, whether or not they include a snare drum. We find reference and quotes from famous orchestral repertoire itself. And if you are simply unfamiliar with this repertoire, this is going to be very disconcerting. This is going to be very difficult to follow. And I remember the first time I encountered Delacluse, at least his work, I had to approach teachers who were much more familiar with his work and say, what's going on here? Why don't I understand what's going on with his music? And they would say to me, well, are you familiar with this classical piece or this orchestral piece? And I said, no, sadly I'm not. And they said, well, that's why it doesn't make sense, because look at this passage here. It's directly referencing this, or this rhythm here is referencing this. And I wasn't familiar with those original pieces that were being referenced. And this gives us some clue as well as to why Delacluse lacks any sticking. And it's because, unlike in the rudimental styles, the means with which you play the phrase is generally considered to be unimportant. In simple terms, Delacluse didn't really care which hand you used to play the strokes. He cared about the sound you produced. So I was lucky enough to talk to a drummer called Rob Knopper, who was working in the New York Metropolitan Orchestra as the snare drummer. And he is something of an expert on Delacluse and has himself produced some wonderful recordings of Delacluse's work. And he said to me that he had spoken to Jacques Delacluse before he died, and Delacluse said that he wanted the student to make the pieces their own. He didn't want them to feel that they were confined by the sticking that he had imposed upon them. He wanted them to explore the musical vocabulary and turn it into their own and perform it in the way that made most sense to them. So he intentionally left the sticking out. Anyway, I don't want to go too far down the path of musical analysis for orchestral drumming, but nevertheless, the works of Delacluse, especially 12 Etudes, 12 studies, bring us one of the main collections of the modern rudimental repertoire. Likewise, I have already mentioned one, the late great Michael Skinner, a British orchestral composer who certainly composed predominantly in the orchestral style. So when you listen to or play Michael Skinner's performances, many of them found within the Trinity syllabus, you find pieces in the orchestral style reminiscent of Delacluse. Sometimes there is sticking given, but most of the time there isn't. Most of the time, the way in which a role is performed, whether it's an open role or a closed buzz role, is left to the interpretation of the performer. And this is very orchestral in nature. It's not about how, It's about what is produced, the sound that's produced, and it's about the interpretation as well. So for those looking to explore this sort of repertoire, Michael Skinner's collection found within the Trinity syllabus is a very good starting point. And again, as with the contemporary rudimental tradition, we find modern composers, Anthony Cerrone, Mitchell Peters in America, composing in a more orchestral style and breaking away from the rudimental tradition. So that's a pretty brief synopsis of the four main traditions: the orchestral tradition, modern repertoire, and really what I'm talking about when I refer to the repertoire itself. Now, just to finish, I want to leave you with a few recommendations that put all these things together. I've already mentioned a few of them, but let me go through them anyway. So for the Swiss tradition, I think the volumes by Fritz Berger are a great starting point. The collections of Basler Trommeln are great collections of Swiss work. For the French, I would suggest the 4 volumes of Ordonnance de Tambour by Robert Goutte and Superior Technique by Guy Lefebvre. Staying with France, I would also recommend the Deux Etudes by Jacques Delacluse. The UK is very hard to recommend for because, as I say, there are very few publications that are dedicated to collections of traditional material. I would love for you to let me know if you find some. But the only thing I've actually been able to find, as I say, when I was researching this, the Royal Scottish Pipe Band Association has collections of repertoire which they use for their championships, and I believe they are available to download for those people wishing to get involved in that. But they should be available publicly as well, although you would have to check that out for yourselves. But unfortunately, there are very few, if any, dedicated publications I could recommend to get involved and explore the traditionally British marching repertoire, or even the Scottish. But have a look at the Royal Society for the Pipe Band Association, the Royal Scottish Pipe Band Association, their collection of pieces, because that might be a good starting point. For America, we are much better served. I would recommend the Nard book, America's Drum Solos, Will Coxon's collection of 150 drum solos, 2 books by Pratt, 14 Modern Contest Solos and Rudimental Solos for Accomplished Drummers, the Black Book. I would recommend collections by Mitchell Peters and Anthony Cerrone. And I would recommend all of the collections by Joe Tompkins. So 8 rudimental solos for snare drum, the 4 volumes of French-American rudimental solos, and by Bob Becker, he's got a collection called Rudimental Arithmetic, which has 8 pieces in them. And finally, of course, the aforementioned Michael Skinner. The best way to find and access his works is through the Trinity grade books. They are not very expensive, and I think there are only 2. There's grades 1 to 5, and then there's grades 6 to 8 that contain many of his pieces. So that is a great starting point for Michael Skinner and his collection. Now, for me, I found myself progressively more and more interested in the repertoire as I studied the solo instrument more, as I studied the snare drum more, and all of these composers have really directly influenced me to contribute my own work to the global repertoire. I really enjoy myself composing for the snare drum, exploring these rhythmic ideas, exploring the different traditions, exploring the different composers, and then producing my own works, either in their similar vein or in an original vein, unique to me. So I have a number of collections of repertoire, both educational and purely for performance. These include 2 volumes of collections called Snare Drum Compositions. So Snare Drum Compositions Volume 1 and Snare Drum Volume 2. Snare Drum Compositions Volume 2 with the subtitle Meditations are collections of snare drum repertoire. I also have a collection called Contemporary Marches for snare drum, which include marches for the snare drum with bass drum accompaniment, although of course can be performed solo. I've got a collection of duets with marimba called the Music Box Suite, 5 pieces for snare drum and marimba. And I have a massive collection called the Snare Drum Virtuoso. Of course, you might have heard of it. The very book after which this podcast is named is another collection of repertoire, both educational and for the points of view of performance. So anybody who would like to explore my work further can easily find all of my work in these collections. I wanted to take this opportunity to try to clarify what I mean when I make reference to, quote, the repertoire. I talk about it a lot to students and in this podcast and on my videos on YouTube about how important it is to engage with the repertoire. So hopefully today I've gone some way to clarifying precisely what I mean, and you listening to this may have some ideas as to where you might find repertoire that you are interested in. So good luck with your search. Good luck with your playing. Thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to seeing you next time on the Snare Drum Virtuoso. To play us out, I think we will listen to another Michael Skinner piece. This is very simply a rudimental study from the Grade 8 collection, and it is simply called Grade 8 Rudimental Study. So once again, in tribute to Michael Skinner, here is Michael Skinner's Grade 8 Rudimental Study. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.